My name is Joanna Prescott, and I was 33 years old the night my ex-mother-in-law tried to destroy me at my own cousin's engagement party. I need to back up a little, because you won't understand why that night mattered so much unless you understand what came before it. And what came before it was 4 years of a marriage I thought was forever, followed by a divorce that nearly broke me in half, followed by 18 months of rebuilding myself from the ground up in a city that still smelled like the life I used to have. I married Derek Cole when I was 27. He was charming in the way that some men are charming, the kind where you don't notice the sharp edges until you've already cut yourself on them. His mother, Lorraine, made sure I understood from the very first dinner that I was not what she had in mind for her only son. She never said it outright, not at first. She was more surgical than that. She'd compliment my dress and then ask where I'd found it, her tone suggesting that wherever it wasn't good enough. She'd ask about my family and then make a small humming noise, the kind that said she'd already formed her opinion and nothing I said would change it. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Bridgeport, Connecticut. My mother was a nurse's aide who worked double shifts at a rehab facility, so my brother and I could have winter coats that actually fit. My father left when I was 9 and sent birthday cards for exactly 2 years before those stopped too. I put myself through UConn on scholarships and student loans and a part-time job at a bookstore that paid $8 an hour. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in structural engineering, and by the time I met Derek at a friend's barbecue in Stamford, I had been working at a mid-sized architecture firm for 3 years, designing load-bearing systems for commercial buildings. None of that mattered to Lorraine. What mattered to Lorraine was that I didn't come from money, that my mother couldn't make it to the rehearsal dinner because she was working an overnight, and that I'd chosen a career where I came home with dust on my boots instead of sitting behind a desk in something silk. Derek and I got married anyway. For the first 2 years, it was good. Not perfect, Lorraine made sure of that, but good enough that I thought the hard parts were behind us. Then Derek's dad passed away and left everything to Lorraine, who suddenly had control of the family construction business, Cole Whitmore General Contracting. Derek had been working there since college, but it was Lorraine who held the purse strings now, and she used them the way some people use a leash. Things changed after that. Derek started coming home later. He stopped asking about my projects at work. When I mentioned that I'd been asked to lead the structural team on a new hospital complex in New Haven, he looked at me like I'd told him what I had for lunch. One night, about 3 years into our marriage, I came home early from a site visit and found a text on his phone from someone named Heather. Just a heart emoji followed by "can't wait for Saturday." When I asked him about it, he told me I was being paranoid. When I pressed, he told me I was being difficult. When I pressed harder, he told me that maybe if I spent less time at construction sites and more time being a wife, he wouldn't need to look elsewhere for conversation. That word conversation did something to me. Not because it hurt, though it did, but because it was so precisely the kind of lie that Lorraine would have coached him to tell. I could almost hear her voice behind his, reshaping the blame until it pointed squarely at me. The divorce took 5 months. I didn't fight for much. I wanted out more than I wanted to be right, and the truth was, I didn't need his money. I had my own salary, my own savings, and a small apartment in Norwalk that I'd rented 3 days after I moved out of the house on Crestwood Drive. What I didn't have, for a long time after, was steadiness. I'd wake up at 2 in the morning and lie there in the dark, running through every conversation, every argument, every time Lorraine had looked at me across a dinner table and made me feel like I was an intruder in my own marriage. And I'd wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't enough. That lasted about 6 months. Then something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no montage, no single turning point, where the music swelled and I suddenly believed in myself again. It was slower than that. I started running in the mornings, 3 miles at first, and then 5, and then 7, and somewhere around mile 4, I'd stop hearing Lorraine's voice. I picked up a certification in seismic retrofit design that I'd been putting off for years. I reconnected with my college roommate, Danielle, who dragged me to a pottery class on Tuesday nights, even though I was terrible at it, and we both knew it. I started sleeping through the night again. I stopped checking Derek's social media. I began to feel, for the first time since the wedding, like the outline of my own life was something I'd drawn myself, instead of something that had been drawn for me. And then I met Graham. I met him at a zoning board meeting, which is about as unromantic as it sounds. I was there representing my firm on a mixed-use development in Stamford, presenting structural feasibility data to a room full of people who mostly wanted to talk about parking. Graham was there because his company, Meridian Capital Partners, was evaluating the project for investment. He was sitting 3 rows back, and when I finished my presentation, he was the only person in the room who asked a question about the actual engineering instead of the square footage of the retail space. We talked afterward in the hallway, and then we talked over coffee the next week, and then we talked over dinner the week after that, and somewhere in the middle of all that talking, I realized I was laughing in a way I hadn't laughed in years. Not the polite laugh I'd learned to produce at Cole family dinners. A real one, the kind that comes from your chest and surprises you. Graham was 41. He'd grown up in Westchester, gone to Wharton for his MBA, and spent 15 years in private equity before co-founding Meridian with 2 partners. He was quiet in the way that some powerful men are quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he'd learned that listening was usually more useful. He wore reading glasses when he worked, and forgot to take them off when he stood up. And he texted me pictures of his neighbor's cat sitting on his car every morning, because he knew it made me smile. We'd been together for 8 months when my cousin Natalie announced her engagement to her boyfriend, James, and threw a party at a restaurant in Greenwich that was fancier than anywhere I'd eaten in my entire life. White tablecloths, candles in hurricane glasses, a string quartet playing something classical that I couldn't name, but that made the room feel like it existed outside of time. I wore a navy dress I'd bought for the occasion. Nothing extravagant, but it fit well and I felt good in it, which was still a novelty I hadn't gotten used to. Graham came with me. We arrived together, his hand resting lightly on my lower back as we walked in, a gesture so ordinary and so constant that I'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing your own breathing. Natalie hugged me at the door and whispered, "You look incredible," and for a moment I felt like maybe I was finally standing on ground that wouldn't shift beneath me. We were about 45 minutes into the evening. I'd had 1 glass of champagne and was talking to Natalie's future mother-in-law about her rose garden. She grew David Austins and was passionate about black spot prevention in a way I found unexpectedly charming, when I felt the air in the room change. Not literally, but something in the atmosphere tightened, the way it does right before a thunderstorm when the pressure drops and the birds go quiet. I turned and saw Lorraine. She was standing near the entrance, wearing a cream blazer and pearl earrings, holding a clutch purse in both hands. Next to her was a woman I recognized after a beat. Karen, Natalie's aunt on her father's side, who apparently knew Lorraine through some charity board they both sat on. Karen must have brought her as a +1. I hadn't known. Natalie hadn't known either, judging by the look on her face when she spotted them. For a long moment, Lorraine and I just looked at each other across the room. The string quartet played on. Waiters moved between the tables carrying trays of bruschetta and shrimp cocktail. The world continued its business around us, indifferent to the fact that my stomach had just dropped 3 inches. She came to me. Of course she did. Lorraine had never been the type to let a moment pass without seizing it, especially a moment that had an audience. "Joanna," she said, arriving at my elbow with the kind of smile that looks warm from a distance but feels cold up close. "I almost didn't recognize you." "Lorraine," I said. "This is a surprise." "Karen invited me," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the entrance. "I had no idea you'd be here, but isn't this nice? It's been what, over a year?" 18 months, I said. "Has it really?" She tilted her head, performing surprise. "Time flies when things are going well, I suppose. And things are going very well for us." She paused, the pause of a woman who has rehearsed what comes next. "Derek is doing wonderfully, by the way. You probably haven't heard." I hadn't. I had, by design, not heard anything about Derek since the day I signed the divorce papers in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and new carpet. But I didn't say that. I just waited, because I had learned, over 4 years of marriage to her son, that Lorraine didn't need you to participate in her conversations. She just needed you to stand there. "He and Heather are expecting their first baby," she said, and her voice did that thing it used to do at family gatherings, pitching upward just enough to carry past the person she was talking to and into the ears of anyone standing nearby. "A little girl, due in March." She waited for the blow to land. I could see it in her eyes, the way they narrowed slightly, searching my face for the crack she expected to find there. And I thought about Heather, about the woman whose name I'd first seen in a text message on my husband's phone, a heart emoji and 4 words that unraveled everything I'd built. I thought about the months I'd spent wondering what she had that I didn't, and then the longer months after that when I realized the question was wrong. It was never about what she had. It was about what Derek was missing, and no woman was going to fill that hole for him, because it wasn't shaped like a woman. It was shaped like his mother's approval, and Heather was just the latest vessel for it. That's nice, I said. I hope they're happy. I meant it. That was the part that would have surprised the version of me who'd lain awake at 2 in the morning, running the same bitter loops. I genuinely meant it. Lorraine blinked. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected tears, or anger, or at the very least the tight-lipped silence of a woman trying not to fall apart in public. What she got instead was calm. Not performed calm, not the brittle composure of someone holding herself together with willpower, but the real kind, the kind that comes from the bones. He's moved on completely, she pressed, recalibrating, searching for a sharper angle. The house, the baby, Heather fits right into the family. It's like you were never even there. I don't say that to be cruel, Joanna. I say it because I think you should know. I took a sip of my champagne. It had gone warm. You do say it to be cruel, Lorraine, I said quietly, not angrily, just as a fact. But that's okay. It doesn't land the way it used to. Something flickered across her face. Not anger, exactly, but frustration, the kind that comes from swinging at something and finding only air. She opened her mouth to say something else, something she'd clearly been storing for this moment, or one like it, when Graham appeared at my side. He'd been across the room talking to James's father about sailing. A subject he knew almost nothing about, but could discuss convincingly because that was one of his gifts. The ability to be genuinely interested in whatever the person in front of him cared about. He must have seen me talking to Lorraine, or maybe he'd just felt the temperature around me drop, because he came over with the unhurried ease of a man who doesn't rush because he doesn't need to. "Everything okay?" he said, his hand finding its place on my back again. "Fine," I said. "Lorraine, this is Graham." "Graham, this is Lorraine Cole, Derek's mother." I watched Lorraine's eyes move to Graham, taking in the tailored sport coat, the quiet confidence, the way he stood next to me like he belonged there. And then I watched something else happen, something slower, a recognition that started in her eyes and moved down to her mouth, which opened slightly before pressing shut again. "Graham Prescott," she said. "Not to me. To him, Mrs. Cole," Graham said, and his tone shifted into something I recognized. Professional courtesy, the voice he used on calls with people whose business he was evaluating. Polite, but measured. "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." Lorraine's hand tightened on her clutched purse. "You know each other?" she said, looking between us, and for the first time since she'd walked over, her voice had lost its performance quality. This was genuine confusion, edging toward something sharper. "We're together," I said simply. "Have been for 8 months." I could see Lorraine trying to process this, trying to reconcile the Joanna she'd constructed in her mind, alone, discarded, presumably struggling, with the Joanna standing in front of her in a navy dress, holding a glass of champagne, with this particular man's hand on her back. But the confusion on her face wasn't just about me and Graham being a couple. It was something else, something specific to Graham himself. "Graham's firm is Meridian Capital," Lorraine said slowly, as though saying it out loud might make it less true. They're investors in. We hold a significant position in Cole Whitmore's parent fund," Graham said, and his voice was careful now, the way it got when he was navigating something that required precision. "Among other portfolios." The color left Lorraine's face. Not all at once. It went in stages, like watching a tide pull back from a shoreline. First the flush in her cheeks, then the warmth around her eyes, then everything else, until she looked like she'd been carved from something pale and brittle. "You oversee Derek's company falls under your. I'm one of 3 managing partners who evaluate portfolio performance." "Yes," Graham said. He wasn't being unkind. He was being exact, which in that moment was worse. A waiter passed between us carrying a tray of something wrapped in prosciutto. The string quartet shifted into a new piece. Natalie laughed at something across the room, bright and oblivious. The party continued around us like water flowing around a stone. "I actually need to talk to Joanna about something work-related for a moment," Graham said, turning to me slightly. "Do you mind if we step out for a minute?" He looked back at Lorraine. "It was good to see you, Mrs. Cole." He guided me toward the terrace. I set my champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray and followed him outside, where the October air was sharp and clean and smelled like fallen leaves and the distant suggestion of someone's fireplace. The restaurant backed up against a stretch of lawn that sloped toward the Long Island Sound, and the moon was doing something dramatic on the water that I might have appreciated more if my heart hadn't been beating so fast. "I got a call from Mitchell right before I came over to you," Graham said, leaning against the terrace railing. Mitchell Park was his senior analyst, The one who wore the same 3 ties in rotation and could find discrepancies in a balance sheet the way some people find typos in a newspaper. He's been doing the quarterly deep dive on the Cole and Whitmore portfolio. They've been underperforming for 2 quarters, so we escalated the review last month. And? I said, though something in his expression told me I already knew the direction this was going. There are transfers out of the operating accounts that don't match any documented expenses. Significant amounts. Mitchell traced them back to personal accounts, and Derek's name is on most of the authorization paperwork. I leaned against the railing next to him and looked out at the water. A boat was moving across the sound, its lights blinking slowly, and for a moment I watched it and thought about how strange life was. How the same man who had once told me I wasn't enough of a wife was now potentially facing an investigation for siphoning money from his own family's company. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "Enough that the board will need to be notified this week, and depending on what the forensic audit turns up, enough that there could be a referral to the state attorney general's office." I thought about the house on Crestwood Drive, about the baby, the little girl due in March, who hadn't done anything to anyone, and who was about to be born into the wreckage of whatever her father had built with money that didn't belong to him. I thought about Heather, who may or may not have known what was happening beneath the surface of the life she'd stepped into. And I thought about Lorraine, who was somewhere inside that restaurant right now, probably standing in a bathroom stall, gripping the edges of a sink, trying to figure out how the evening she'd planned as a victory lap had turned into something else entirely. "I'm sorry," Graham said. "I know this is complicated for you." "It's not, actually," I said, and I was surprised to find that it was true. "Not the way you'd think." He studied my face for a moment, the way he sometimes did when he was trying to decide if I was being honest or just brave. Then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "Okay," I said. We stood there for another minute, not talking, just breathing in the October air and watching the moonlight move on the water. Then he reached over and took my hand, and we went back inside. Lorraine was gone. Karen was still there, looking vaguely confused, telling Natalie's mother that her friend had felt suddenly unwell and had called a car. I caught Natalie's eye across the room, and she gave me a look that said she understood something had happened, even if she didn't know what, and that we'd talk about it later. The rest of the evening passed easily. I danced with Graham to a song the quartet played that I later learned was Debussy. I ate 2 pieces of cake and didn't feel guilty about either one. I listened to James's father tell a story about a sailboat race in Newport that he'd lost spectacularly in 1994, and I laughed. The real kind, from my chest, the kind that surprises you. When we got home that night, and I want to pause here because that word, home, still meant something to me, still felt like a gift I'd given myself. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about Lorraine's face. Not the moment when she'd tried to hurt me. That part I was already forgetting, already filing away in the cabinet, where I kept things that no longer had power over me. What I kept thinking about was the moment after. The moment when she realized that the woman she'd spent 4 years diminishing had not only survived, but had built something real and solid and entirely her own, and that the man standing next to that woman happened to hold the future of her son's career in his hands. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. I had spent months after the divorce imagining what it would feel like to see Lorraine humbled, to watch her understand that she'd been wrong about me, and in my imagination it always felt like fireworks. Bright and loud and satisfying. But the real thing wasn't like that at all. The real thing was quieter. It was the feeling of putting down something heavy that you've been carrying for so long you forgot you were carrying it. It was the sensation of your shoulders dropping and your jaw unclenching and your lungs filling all the way up for what feels like the first time. I thought about my mother, working her overnight shift at the rehab facility in Bridgeport, probably on her feet right now, checking vitals and adjusting IV drips and doing the quiet, unglamorous work that kept other people alive. I thought about the version of myself who had stood in that courtroom signing divorce papers, wondering if she would ever feel whole again. I thought about the 7-mile runs and the pottery class and the seismic retrofit certification and all the small, unsexy, unglamorous things I had done to rebuild a life that no one was going to take credit for but me. Derek's mother had walked into that party planning to remind me of everything I'd lost. Instead, she'd walked out carrying the knowledge of everything her son was about to lose. And the part that I kept turning over in my mind, the part that felt truest, was that I hadn't planned any of it. I hadn't engineered the moment. I hadn't set a trap or orchestrated a confrontation or spent months plotting revenge. I had simply kept living. I had gotten up every morning and gone to work and designed buildings that would keep people safe and fallen in love with a man who asked questions about load-bearing walls at zoning meetings, and the universe, in its own time, had arranged the rest. In the weeks that followed, I heard through various channels what happened to Cole and Whitmore. The forensic audit confirmed what Mitchell had found. Derek had been moving money out of the company's operating accounts for over a year, funneling it into a personal brokerage account and a property in the Berkshires that he'd purchased in Heather's name. The total amount was just under $1.2 million. The board voted to remove him as managing director. Lorraine, who had inherited her husband's majority stake, was forced to choose between letting the company go into receivership or accepting a restructuring plan proposed by Meridian that would effectively strip her of decision-making authority. She chose the restructuring. I heard she cried during the board meeting where the terms were presented. I didn't ask Graham about it, and he didn't volunteer the details. There are some things that don't need to be picked apart. Derek was charged with embezzlement in January. The case was covered in the Stamford Advocate and picked up by a couple of Hartford outlets. Heather, 7 months pregnant then, moved back in with her parents in Darien. I don't know if she and Derek stayed together. I didn't look. One evening in February, about a week after the charges were filed, I was sitting at the kitchen table in the apartment I'd started thinking of as ours. Graham had practically moved in by then, his reading glasses perpetually on the counter, his running shoes by the door, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "This is Lorraine. I know I don't deserve your time, but I need to say something. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about a lot of things. I don't expect you to respond to this, and I won't contact you again." I stared at the message for a long time. Graham was in the other room on a call, his voice a low murmur through the wall, and I sat there in the kitchen with the overhead light buzzing faintly, and the cat from next door sitting on the windowsill outside, watching me with that unblinking patience that cats have. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry, and not because I wanted her to suffer. I just didn't have anything to say. The conversation between us had ended a long time ago, maybe even before it started, and no text message, however honest, was going to reopen it. I set the phone down and went back to the blueprint I'd been reviewing, a new hospital wing in Bridgeport that my firm had been awarded the structural contract for. It was going to be built 6 blocks from the rehab facility where my mother worked, and I'd driven past the site the week before, looking at the empty lot where the building would go, trying to picture the steel frame and the foundation walls and the load paths that would carry the weight of everything above them, and I'd thought about how buildings are a lot like people in that way. The parts that hold everything up are the parts you never see. Graham came out of his office and found me at the table, pencil in hand, glasses sliding down my nose the way his always did. "The Bridgeport project?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "I think we need to reinforce the east foundation. The soil report came back, and there's more clay than we expected." He sat down across from me, not because he understood soil reports. He didn't, not really, but because he understood that when I talked about my work, I was talking about something that mattered to me more than I usually let on. He listened the way he always listened, with his whole attention, and when I finished explaining the problem, he said, "So you'll fix it?" Not a question, a statement. "Yeah," I said, "I'll fix it." That spring, Graham and I flew to Italy for 2 weeks. We stayed in a village outside Florence where the streets were made of stone, and the woman who ran the pension brought us espresso every morning on a tray with a small vase of wildflowers. We walked through vineyards and ate pasta that tasted like it had been made by someone's grandmother, because it had. One afternoon, sitting on a low stone wall overlooking a valley full of olive trees, Graham pulled a ring from his jacket pocket, a simple band with a sapphire that matched the color of the sky, and asked me to marry him. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Not because I was swept up in the romance of the setting, though the setting was admittedly very good, but because I had spent enough years with the wrong person to know exactly what the right one felt like. And it felt like this, quiet, steady, certain. Like a foundation that had been properly laid. We got married in September in a small ceremony at a vineyard in the Hudson Valley. My mother was there, sitting in the front row in a dress she'd bought new for the occasion, crying the quiet, happy tears of a woman who had watched her daughter break and rebuild, and come out the other side holding something she deserved. Natalie was my maid of honor. Danielle read a poem. The pottery class friends came and gave us a vase that one of them had made, slightly lopsided but beautiful in the way that imperfect things sometimes are. I didn't think about Lorraine that day. I didn't think about Derek. I didn't think about the house on Crestwood Drive, or the heart emoji, or the 4 years I'd spent trying to earn the approval of a woman who had decided before I ever walked through her door that I would never be enough. What I thought about, standing there in the late September light with Graham's hands, holding mine and the smell of grapes and cut grass in the air, was my mother's kitchen in Bridgeport, the Formica counter where I used to do my homework, the window above the sink where she'd taped my first report card, the sound of her key in the lock at 6:30 in the morning after a 12-hour shift, and the way she'd still make me scrambled eggs before school, even though she could barely keep her eyes open. She never told me I couldn't have a good life. She just showed me what it looked like to build one, day after day, without fanfare, without anyone watching, without the luxury of believing that the world owed you anything. And now here I was, standing in a vineyard, marrying a man who loved me the way I deserved to be loved, having built a career that mattered with my own two hands, and understanding finally, completely, all the way down to my bones, that the best thing I ever did was keep going. Not to prove Lorraine wrong. Not to show Derek what he'd lost. Not for revenge or validation, or any of the reasons I might have given you if you'd asked me a year earlier. I kept going, because that was the only choice that was ever really mine, and it turned out to be the only one I needed. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever had someone try to convince you that you weren't enough, and you're still standing, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button before you leave. I tell these stories every week. Real stories about betrayal, resilience, and the kind of justice that shows up when you stop chasing it and start building something worth having. I'd love to have you here for the next one. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon.